Welcome back to the arena track. We're coming to our last arena talk and then the closing keynote. But first we're having Stefan Soesanto from ETH, Center for Security Studies at ETH. Last year we had a talk by Brandon Valeriano here on stage, and he would talk about how cyber war does not exist. Apparently the war in Ukraine is continuing, and we thought we need to do, or we want to bring something that topic and maybe do a bit of a counterpart. We want to talk or have somebody present who's looking into that and say, actually, it does exist in certain situations or certain aspects of the war are really about cyber, and there is interesting research going on, and Stefan is one of the people doing that research, focusing on the Ukrainian side. Thank you for coming here, and your stage is here.
Great. Thank you for having me. Let's see. All right, my slides are up. Can we put the slides also in front? Because I don't see them in front. Or do I have to look? Oh, cool. Thanks. So my name is Stefan Soesanto. I'm a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. I lead the cyber defense project there, and I'm also a co-team head of the risk and resilience team. Our main stakeholder, which is also the mission of ETH, is to educate the public, as well as to support the federal administration. For my team, it's primarily the VBS, so Swiss Defense Department. Within the risk and resilience team, we also work with the BAPS. What's the BAPS translation? Department for, well, you all know what it is. So today, I will talk you through my thinking on trying to make sense on data dumps and data leaks in times of war and peace. It's kind of like, if we start, it's like, why do I even talk about this, right? So the reason is the war in Ukraine. What we saw pretty much in the first year was that there was massive data dumps and data leaks that pretty much nobody was able to look at. It's like journalists were overwhelmed, academics were overwhelmed, analysts were overwhelmed, and the question was always, okay, which data dumps are important? What data leaks kind of mattered? Do we have to go through each and all of them and figure out, it's like, what is the veracity? What's the validity of them? What's the value here? And I got so many requests from journalists, but also policymakers that were like, look, somebody has to look at this. There might be some important in this stuff, right? But nobody was able to. There was so much data that, like, there were terabytes of data that were just dumped into the public domain. It's like, okay, this is from a Russian company, this is from a Ukrainian company, this is maybe from a European company. And you're like, why do I care? Why does it matter, right? And it matters, because this situation is probably going to repeat in this war between Hamas and Israel. It's like we currently see it ramping up already. We have data dumps that are already being posted on some forums. Some of these are fake, right? The top one, simply saying it's like, this is from the Israeli Ministry of Defense. It's like, hey, just download this. There's no other information whatsoever. The other part, the real one, is somebody dumped a database on healthcare systems, so healthcare data for, I think, 1.3 million Palestinians. And this is real data, so it was verified. But then, of course, on Telegram, and I don't know if anybody here is on Telegram, whether you're on there, like whether you follow certain groups, but this is a very different environment. Like, there are dumps every single day. And nobody tracks them, nobody has any clue in terms of, are these real, are these fake, whatsoever. And this is currently ramping up in the context of the Israel-Hamas war. Now, when it comes to the Ukraine war, there are two sides of this, right? So Kiba Sportiv is a Ukrainian group. Who ever heard of Kiba Sportiv, also known as cyber resistance? Just raise your hand. There's literally nobody? All right, so you learned something today. Everybody knows Phineas Fisher, right? Hacking team, dumping those internal emails and stuff like that, right? Phineas Fisher is very known. But Kiba Sportiv is not like Phineas Fisher. Nemezida, also known as Project Nemesis, is a Russian kind of threat actor, pretty much related to Russian military intelligence service. We know this because the way they dump and what they dump is pretty much that information kind of has an intelligence. It's not really open source in that sense. They're not really RAID Forum, right? Everybody here knows RAID Forum, 2015, Takedown 2022. Then we have New Anonymous that came into this fold. It's like random groups, random people just being there, breaching everything, any kind of database they could find, any kind of website, any kind of FTP server, everything. Everything in the .ru domain was up for grabs. They're not like Vice Society. Everybody knows Vice Society because of the stuff they've ran against Swiss providers, right? Swiss companies. And DDoS secrets also played a massive role in the first year when it came to this conflict. And DDoS secrets not like WikiLeaks. What DDoS secret did was, they say they're kind of journalists, they're not really, but they essentially help new anonymous people or groups to take on their data dumps, terabytes of data, and host them on their torrents. So they essentially gave them the entryway of literally sending massive amount of data and hosting them on torrent, and so everybody can download them. There was no real benefit. No journalists looked at this stuff. DDoS secrets barely looked at this thing. They were like, it's too much stuff. We don't know what is in there. We don't know whether it's PII or whatever. We just do the best we can, and that's simply not good enough when it's in a time of war. Because when you lose data and information in PII in wartime, this can get people killed. Now, more to the happy side. In everyday interaction, the terms data dumps and data leaks are used synonymously. Everybody knows it. It's kind of like, yeah, we kind of know what data leaks are, what data dumps are. We know the differences, right? So general definitions, dumps are large amounts of data, usually, that are transferred from one system or location to another. And leaks are sensitive data that is unknowingly exposed. It's the bare and the minimum definition. But it's kind of also a wrong definition because data dumps are not usually, or are in the context of warfare, are not necessarily large. Now, the general differences as well are two sorts. When it comes to information density and when it comes to the dissemination vector. So in data dumps, we usually consider them to be information poor. They're random files, random Excel sheets. It's like you don't really know what you're looking at there. It's like business internals. Nobody can really make sense of it if you don't have the context of it, right? Then leaks, they're generally information rich, so it's PII, it's financial data, it's all the kinds of stuff you immediately kind of know. It's like passport numbers and so forth. The dissemination vector for dumps is pretty clear. We dump this in the public domain with little specifics on its origins, content, how it was exfiltrated, who it's addressed to. It's like, what's the overall purpose of this dump? Usually, like, hacktivists, hacking groups, they don't give you anything of that. Some are like more a little bit forward, they make stuff up. They're like, hey, we have a guy that works for the Ukrainian international, the International Foreign Legion. On the ground, he works together with the SBU. He kind of gave us this tip, and then we breached this infrastructure, and this is the result, right? It's all bullshit. But you have to deal, sometimes you have to talk to these groups and be like, okay, what do you actually know? And does this make sense? With leaks, it's usually released via a trusted intermediator. This can be newspapers, journalists, and so forth. But they're also like shady outlets, and I will show you this later in the end. They're contextualized in their origin usually. We know what the content is, and we know who found it. We know how it was exfiltrated, who it was given to, and why. So that's why we call Snowden leaks, not Snowden dumps. Very clear, very easy. Now in Switzerland, we know data leaks, right? Swiss secrets and so on, like newspapers even going to the whistleblowers, like, hey, can we interview guys? Can you, like, why did you do this, right? And then, of course, federal administration looks for this guy, is like, hey, maybe we have to kind of hunt this guy down. And then, of course, the journalists do this amazing work of going through all this data they received, have a social database, write down follow-up articles. It's like it's really being used, the data that you give them. Similarly, the attack on Rolle, same with explain stuff. It's kind of a data dump. Actually, it's not really a data leak. But they're also very careful in terms of what they were giving to you. Sometimes not as much, but it's like it's very clear it's for a certain specific audience. Like not every journalist knows all the leak sites that are on the Onion network, right? So it's kind of difficult for some people to navigate this. If we do this more in an academic fashion, we can have this dump leak spectrum. On the left side, wait, your left. On the left side, the perfect leak, you have perfect information. On the right side, you have the perfect dump. There's literally no information whatsoever in there, right? But what happens in the space in between? It's like, okay, we have some information. And in peacetime, this makes sense, because in the space in between, we have these cases that naturally converge to one side or the other, depending on the relevancy. And the relevancy literally depends on data availability, on journalists, on researchers, threat intel people that are looking this stuff, companies that react to it. It's like the public that picks this up, and so forth. So there might have been really cool data leaks, but nobody has picked them up, and so they just disappear. So for this system to function appropriately, there needs to be this ecosystem where everybody plays their role in this. It's same for the ransomware ecosystem. If it breaks down, the chain breaks down somewhere, the ransom ecosystem wouldn't work as nicely enough as it currently does, right? So the rhetoric question, what if there is a massive data leak, data dump, and literally nobody cares about it, right? Now in wartime, the problem is that you already have the existing ecosystem that you have to deal with. And suddenly new ecosystems pop up. It's like new threat actors are coming in, new groups are resurfacing, or old groups are resurfacing, they're entering the playing field. Anything becomes literally the target for whatever reason. They just make stuff up. Anything can get dumped and leaked. And these ecosystems, they've developed kind of their sort of own internal dynamics, which is kind of strange sometimes. And we can discern them into two parts. It's like the old school hacktivism part, they're really doing this for political reasons and so forth. And with them in one bucket, you also have the war grifters, particularly New Anonymous. It's kind of the war grifting kind of groups. They just hop from one conflict to the next. It's like now they're in Israel, they were on Sudan before, and they did Ukraine, and then they just travel around. It's a traveling circus, essentially. They're chasing headlines, they're chasing clouds, they're chasing attention, and they usually get it. The other part is an intermix of like state-encouraged groups, state-shaped groups, state-coordinated groups, state-ordered groups, and state-controlled groups. They're small, very little differences between them. And it's really an attribution challenge, whether you want to put a group as state-encouraged or whether you want to put a group in the bucket of state-controlled. It's like, how much control does the state exercise on this group? And I will show you later like a case. Now, the problem that we're dealing with overall is that people are interested in secrets. They're interested in conflict dynamics, and they're interested in news. And if you're trying to discourage them by saying, well, don't look at this stuff, don't download this stuff, that never works. But the fact is very few people actually download data dumps. That's the irony in all of this. But they talk about it. They retweet it. They write about it. It's kind of it develops its own kind of history and its own kind of audience. Very few people in the industry have the time and resources to actually look at every data leak or at one data leak if it's not really like fitting in your profile. Right? So the cost-benefit calculation is usually not there. So few data dumps and data leaks actually get investigated. Now, the general differences between a data dump and a data leak do not matter in wartime, because anything could be kind of sensitive, include sensitive information. Journalists and academics and youth, actually, that's what I would press for, they need kind of shortcuts to navigate this environment. And the reason for this is let's do this first. needs kind of shortcuts. And so part of the shortcuts that we came up with is kind of like, okay, you need to look at the groups in terms of what are the hosting choices. It's like, where do they host their data dumps? And there's a great variety on those. Russian groups rarely use any kind of Ukrainian providers or European providers. They tend to use Russian providers. Ukrainian groups are all over the place usually, but there's some groups that literally depend on one specific provider because it just perfectly aligns for them. Data availability. It's like, do they provide mirror links? Do they re-upload the data leaks and data dumps? Like some groups, they literally dump it one time, it gets taken down, and they never re-upload it. You never see this data again. So the question then becomes, like, how valuable was that data leak to the group itself? If the group itself doesn't care, then why should anybody else, right? Similar with language. We've seen so many groups in this Ukraine conflict that simply they do not have the Russian language skills to traverse through all the data that they have exfiltrated. There's no way they can do this with Google Translate or whatever to put every single file through that. Doesn't work. So they actually don't know what they have, which is, again, an indicator of like, you breach, you just exfiltrate everything, you dump it, and, well, what happens then may happen, right? Size as well. Generally, it is an inverse relationship. The larger the data dump, the less valuable the information is. So small data dumps actually usually have the most valuable information. So that's why when DDoS secrets host all this massive amount of data, you immediately you can kind of grasp, it's like there's nothing in there. And if there's something in there, you will probably never find it. Similarly, in terms of origin, the more detailed the information is on where the data was exfiltrated from and how it was exfiltrated, the higher the likelihood is that this data dump or data leak is legit. There are many other reasons on that, like the history of a group, that it's kind of weird because some journalists and some academics, they don't really look at the history of a group, they just look at the leak. And so there's no contextualization as such. Now, there are other shortcuts, which is actually looking at the ecosystem itself. So Nestle did this, was pretty lucky, I would say, actually. So this was in March 2022, where all the anonymous accounts on Twitter were essentially posting this breaking news. It's like, oh, we exfiltrated, we got this 10 gigabytes of data from Nestle. It's like, this is kind of the repercussion, the retaliation for Nestle still doing business in Russia, right? And this went all over the place. Like, it was thousands of people liked this, thousands of people retweeted it. This is just a small fraction of what happened online. The problem of this was that actually the breach data came from a different group called Kelvin Security. And the data breach actually happened a year ago. So what Kelvin Security did was they gave it to one guy in an anonymous group, and that guy essentially then disseminated it and presented it like, oh, we did this, and this is the political reason why, right? Which is like bullshit. But it's kind of really nice that Kelvin Security called them out on this one, because then, of course, Nestle could hop on and be like, yeah, this was actually a leak, a data that was on a test site, so it's like, you had double insurance, essentially, right? So the other group tells you this is not from Anonymous, this is not theirs, and then you have Nestle coming out and saying, like, this is actually not data that was important to anybody. Now, this group is very different. Kiba Sportif, maybe some of you know this group because there was an article in Le Temps by Camille. She wrote about the Babakov leaks. Alexander Babakov is the vice president of the Russian Duma. And so what Kiba Sportif did was they breached this private email account. And they dumped this stuff into the public domain, but not really everything. So they gave part of that stuff to specific outlets, part of that stuff was given to journalists, and so forth. And Le Temps found a Swiss connection in the data dump because Babakov was essentially, he skirted international sanctions by traveling to different countries to get healthcare treatments. And so then you have this web of like EDA emails that's saying, yeah, you can travel for health reasons to Switzerland and so forth, that's fine. And in his private emails, you actually see that while he was in Switzerland, while he was in Bulgaria and all the other EU member states, he was doing business on the side. So that was pretty cool stuff that they were able to find because Kiba Sportif is not as any other group out there. They're very special. So what this group is that they appeared 1 year into the war on February 24th. They self-subscribed themselves as a team of activists who have been cooperating with various law enforcement agencies in Ukraine since 2014. So they claim there's a history and so forth, and we actually know what we're doing, right? We cannot verify any of that information currently. We don't know who the individual members are. Like Kiba Sportif literally popped up on February 24th, 2023. There's no other information prior to that. Now, what makes this group so interesting is that they specialized in breaching the private email accounts of Russian military officers, their spouses, and Russian persons of interest. So these are judges, these are Russian athletes, these are Russian bloggers, military bloggers primarily, and the reason why they're doing this is that there's a lot of information in those private email accounts. And so their MO is, instead of just dumping this into the public, we take all that information in, and the first pick is for the Ukraine Intelligence Service. So we give it to the Ukraine Intelligence Service. They're very clear about this. This was the first post on Telegram saying, like, there's a special relationship here. Now, the second part of the story is that after the intelligence service gets their pick and deems the data of no operational value anymore, then that data travels outside into the ecosystem. So there are three players that are important. One is the National Resistance Center. The National Resistance Center was created by the Ukrainian government by law, It's created by, or it's run by the Ukraine Special Operations Forces, so there's a military angle, and they're responsible for, I can actually show this, they're responsible for organizing the resistance in every domain, essentially, online, offline, to organize like partisan groups in Ukraine. Now, if you go on the website and look for cyber, and this is a translation only, you see that Kybersportiv is already in there, like cyber resistance, cyber resistance, and so on. Like this is actually the logo. On the right-hand side is the logo of the National Resistance Center. On the left side is the logo of Kybersportiv. See any similarities there? Maybe, right? Now, the second part of this this operation is Infom Napalm. I don't know if anybody here knows Infom Napalm. If you follow the Ukraine conflict, Infom Napalm is probably the resource if you want to get any kind of interesting information. They are an international volunteer community, so people from across the world are working for them. They translate all their work in numerous different languages, and they have deep links both to hacktivists, but also to the state. Now, Infom Napalm, yeah, well, I can tell you more, but let's stay with that. So the website looks actually like this. Again, you see Kybersportiv all over, plastered their logo all over the place, right? Now, the last character in this nexus is Mirotvorets. Anybody here heard ever of Mirotvorets, also known as the peacekeeper? No. If you don't know anything about Mirotvorets, you don't know anything about the Ukraine war. That's pretty much the baseline of this. Now, Mirotvorets is what essentially stood up by an NGO, or it's kind of a volunteer group, but it's deeply supported by the Ukraine Ministry of the Interior. Essentially, this is an extensive kill list of Russian people of interest. Most of them are military, intelligence service, but also private individuals. There are also Ukrainian citizens on there. And the problem here is, like, there are also famous people on there. Like Elon Musk was at one time listed on that website, right? Like, you might be like, okay, it's just a website where people are listed and so forth, it doesn't matter. No. You have to understand, Mirotvorets is literally used by the Ukrainian border guards to check who is able to enter Ukraine. So if you enter from Bulgaria, they will check your passport, they will go on the Mirotvorets website and check your name against that and be like, well, is he on there? Is he not? Because Mirotvorets is literally a website that identifies the enemies of Ukraine. They don't kid around there. Similarly, Mirotvorets also lists, like, they don't shy away from listing children. So people who are deemed as traitors to the Ukraine government, to the Ukraine state, their children will be listed on the website as well, as young as 6 years old, with their passport, birthday, home address, and so forth. Now, you might be like, okay, what does it matter if their children are listed on there, right? Well, the problem is, and this is how the website looks like, the problem is that people actually get killed because they're on there. There were at least 2 incidents where people were assassinated because they were on the list. And it's literally, like, the Russians have something equivalent to that, but the Russians are not that well organized. Because Mirotvorets literally also has the security service involved and so forth. So it's literally, you get this information from these military officers, you get massive kind of databases of individuals in different military units, you get spouses, the information of spouses, their children, their passports, everything is being funneled into this ecosystem. And it's being disseminated there. So all the data that Kybersportiv essentially exfiltrated, you will find on Mirotvorets in terms of all the people that are listed in those emails. And so what our suspicion is that Kybersportiv is not just any actor, but they're actually a state-coordinated hacking group. So they receive targets likely from the Ukraine intelligence service and have a special relationship with Ukraine Spec Ops. Now, if this doesn't convince you, is this case. Now, everybody knows this wanted poster, right? US presidential election, the 12 people who interfered in the US presidential election, Russian military intelligence service, but there were only 11 pictures on there. The 12th picture was never revealed. This guy, Viktor Netishko. Now, Viktor Netishko is the head of this whole operation, is the head of Fancy Bear, essentially, right? So what Kybersportiv did was they posted the picture of Viktor Netishko and his wife and his son Daniel. And the vector that shows is that they didn't breach his email account, they breached the email account of his wife. So then we got this picture out, right? This was the first picture. The way they posted it is like, we will go where the FBI didn't dare to go. And so now we know who Viktor Netishko is. Now, the question that for us in Switzerland is relevant is, do these private email accounts of military spouses kind of enjoy any protection under IHL applicable in cyberspace? It's like, are they protected? I mean, they're civilians, right? But they also have the military connection. So do they have any protection in there? Similarly, do the private email accounts of children kind of enjoy any protections in there? Should there be a rule? There are no rules currently, nobody calls them out, so we don't know. And particularly, are these dumpling challenges, like, are they relevant for Switzerland with its militia system? It's like, I know there's definitely a lot of people here that are reservists, that served in the military armed forces and so forth. It's like, would you be fine with your children and your wife and girlfriends being targeted? I don't think so. I don't think that's acceptable conduct, but there are no rules. We haven't really talked about this. So I'll leave you with these three things. One, there is an education need and demand when it comes to understanding and categorizing data dumps and data leaks. So the more pressing, the more unstable geopolitics become. There's a general need to clearly explain the ecosystem in which data dumps and data leaks are released into, like contextualization, explain the conflict dynamics there. And there's an ongoing evolution in how data dumps and data leaks are being released. And this is essentially personalization. We see this in ransomware groups. We see this in military operations right now, or if you want to call them information warfare operations. But this gets personal. So the future war in the Israel-Hamas context will probably also get really personal. And so with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Do we have questions from the audience? No questions from the audience. Well, I have to fill the gap then. Stefan, I think what we're seeing in wars generally, and this war is like the dissolution of rules. Once a war is, you break the law, you go to war, and then even not only the aggressor, but even the defenders, they're starting to breach the rules, they're starting to do things they would not do outside war. And Switzerland, who is always for a rule-based international politics, I mean, what does it mean to us? I mean, we're probably getting a bit fearful, I think. I'm afraid what this leads to. Do we have a role in this? Or do we just watch this? Or is there something that Switzerland should do, our politicians should do?
Like, honestly, I don't think there's anything anybody can do. These are like new conduct that is being formed, new rules that are being created. And there are no rules currently in that space, no matter what the ICRC may think they are, or where they try to impose certain rules or kind of put forward certain rules that activist groups, for example, should adhere to. Like, they did these 8 rules and 4 principles or whatever it was immediately breached afterwards. I mean, a few groups essentially said, we support this, but immediately after it was broken. So this is an evolutionary process with all norms. It's like you have to have years and years of kind of norms building where you get kind of new kind of rules consensus. Currently, there's nothing there. And the world is not getting any more stable. So in that sense, I don't think there are any rules. I don't think when it comes to military conduct in this space or intelligence conduct in this space, there are any rules. So what we might perceive as kind of democratic nations, like we have certain values that we have ingrained in us, it's like we're going to be severely challenged and probably put on the back foot because the others don't play by our rules. And so the question then is, do we adapt to the new realities in that space, or do we stand by what we think is right and true? And I don't think anybody has a solution. We'll just see what happens, and if we fall flat on the face, it's like, that's how it's going to be. But until that, it's like learning by doing and learning by just suffering, I guess.
But you continue to observe the situation for us.
Yeah, we observe the situation. We're not so much involved in the Israel-Hamas conflict because like if you're already looking at like almost 200 different actors, 200 different groups that are just popping up and new groups form, old groups go away, you cannot just put on and look at 200 more groups in the Israel-Hamas conflict. Somebody else has to do that. It's just not possible. Like, quality-wise and quantity-wise.
Quality-wise.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much, Stefan, for coming. I have a bit of chocolate for you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your presentation.
Thank you very much.